Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. It's been a while, but we're back. Episode 354, React Native Screens with Krzysztof.
All right. Welcome back, React Native Radio listeners. I'm Mazen, she's Robin, and we're React Native Radio. Today we have a cool guest with us. We have Krzysztof Magiera. Krzysztof, welcome to the show.
Harji.
Magiera. I always say Magiera. Magiera. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you are coming into an elite group of guests on React Native Radio. This might be your, technically, fourth time, but we're going to call it third time because that's, third time under IR RNR. So the first time you were on with us was when we were talking about Radon, which is no longer Radon.
Well, no, it is now Radon. It was React Native IDE when we talked about it. And then that's React Native said, no, you can't call it that. Radon is a really cool name, though. So
I agree. RNR 309. And then within that same year, we talked about Reanimated 2, the launch of that. And both of those, I think, were, Robin and I and you. So it's really cool to kind of have you back.
Yeah, really glad to be back.
Yeah. A lot of our guests and audience already knows you or have heard about you. But for those that haven't, could you please introduce yourself?
Of course. So my name is Krzysztof. I'm a co-founder and director of engineering at Software Mention. I also happen to be a former member of React Native core team at Facebook. So I was at Facebook when the project kind of started and then launched as an open source. And then I moved to work at Software Mention, where I created some of the popular React Native packages like Reanimated, Screens, or Gesture Handler, and also Radon.
And also Radon,
yeah. Let's not forget Radon.
So yeah, you're a pretty important part of the React Native community. Like historically, you've been around for a long time and for some pretty key moments. So we are really excited to be able to talk to you today.
Yeah. Before we get into our topic, let's hear from our sponsor. Infinite Red is a premier React Native consultancy located fully remote in the US. We're a team of 30 senior plus level React Native developers and support staff and have been doing this for over a decade. If you're looking for React Native expertise for your next project, hit us up at infinite.red/radio. Don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. All right, let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about React Native screens, right? A lot of us know when you want to install navigation in your library, whether it's React Navigation or Expo Router, you need to install React Native screens. The best way I like to say about it is React Native screens is always like the bridesmaid, but never the bride. No one really uses or say they use React Native screens, right? You always say Expo Router or React Navigation. Without getting into the weeds of it all now, as we're going to get into it a little bit later, can you give us the elevator pitch for React Native screens and what it accomplishes?
Sure. So it definitely depends who are you with in the elevator, but assuming that those are the people listening to React Native Radio podcast, I'd say there's some familiarity with React Native. In the elevator, it would be that screens gives you a way of rendering native primitives for navigation, like the navigation headers, models, stuff like that. So this is what's the role is to expose those type of primitives such that they can be used in your app and for your app to feel more kind of native and more aligned with other apps that people might have on Android or iOS devices.
Why, usually when we talk about packages and stuff that we've built as developers, we usually, tend to have a problem and we build something to kind of fix that problem. Why did you originally build React Native screens?
So the main motivation was similar to how we came up with other libraries that we built at Software Mention. So we work on some projects for our clients. And in this particular case, I remember there were two kind of projects I worked on at the time. And one had a memory related issue where the memory usage would just skyrocket. And after debugging this problem, I ended up figuring out that it was because every single screen that the app had basically a background image that was like very big. And whenever you would open that screen, it would like open on the stack. And then you would have another screen with the same background image on the stack. And of course, the image was like much bigger than it should have been because it was like blurred. And so you could have actually reduced the quality significantly for that image. But it was loaded on every single screen, and those screens were stacked up. So where you were opening things on top of each other, you would actually get that image loaded and it would persist there. And so whenever there's some issue that I'm kind of debugging or just working with React Native in general, and I encounter some problem, so one way of approaching the problem is like how this is solved in native Android and native iOS. So I was my background is in native development, so that's how I approach this. And on those native platforms, you don't really have that problem because the way the stacks are designed when you open new screens on top of each other is that they kind of communicate with the components that are installed, and they can free some resources that they're allocating. So another instance of the problem we actually tracked on a different app at the time, and it was related to a maps component. So there's a map component where you'd open like a setting pane, it would still like render the map and kind of keep those resources allocated for the map. So the main objective was to kind of address this problem where the screens that are no longer visible for the user because they navigated into like a stacked items such that they can actually free up some resources. So that's how the screens came to be.
Yeah. So thanks, Krzysztof, for that. It's always good to know that what we're doing in React Native, even though it's in JavaScript, you're able to kind of point us to the native APIs as a native developer would when it comes to navigation and stack, which is a very important fundamental part of a mobile application. So speaking generally, React Native Screens is basically is exposing the native APIs so that such libraries like React Navigation and Expo Router can reference those native APIs seamlessly and be able to work as a navigation library. Correct?
Yeah, that's a good way of framing that. Yep.
Now, it feels like screens, we're going to call it screens. Can't just call it React Native Screens every time. Screens almost feels like a default part of the React Native ecosystem now. It's just one of those packages, with like gesture handler, safe area context, you name it. It's always installed, and you almost have to install it unless you have a single page app, which I don't think exists anymore these days. Why is it separate from React Navigation or even like React Native Core specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know answer for. I mean,
made by different people,
is,
I guess.
Yeah, what's funny is that when we first published library, we have on GitHub, you have this like a field for the headline for the project. You can see like a description for the project, which should be like relatively short. So in the hindsight, it hasn't been like a very smart description for the project, but what we put in there was that Screens is the most important library you will never use, directly in parentheses. So when we were building it, it was more like we're thinking more about the foundational parts rather than the API bits. And I feel like this kind of dividing those two bits still makes a lot of sense and makes things easier for us to iterate on and improve when we have this split between things that just integrate with the native layer, the native operating system, native primitives, and then the API, and that just can be different depending on like how you want to use it. So we have Expo Router, which has fundamentally different API compared to React Navigation, for example. So we were kind of just thinking about those type of things, and it kind of similarly also goes for Reanimated, where not sure if any of you remember, like the first version of Reanimated was like the API was super ugly and wasn't meant really for. The way we consider it wasn't meant for people to use the API directly, but to come up with a different higher level abstractions that would make this much easier to use, but then give you the whole performance of and being able to run the animations on the UI thread. So that was kind of the purpose of like Reanimated initially. But once we observed that people start using it directly, and just get really confused about the API. That's where we figured out we really should come up with a better API and people would want to use that directly. But this wasn't the case for screens. We already at the point where when we released screens, the React navigation already existed. People were using it, and since then we have 3 major releases in React navigation. I mean, perhaps even more because we're at version 8 right now, I think. So I'm not sure like which version was in 2018 when we released screens, but at least 3 times it just changed like really significantly. There was like a big shift in like how the API is structured for React navigation. So, and screens kind of could iterate separately and fix a lot of issues that typically are related to ways we use UIKit, interact with iOS or interact with Android APIs. So it kind of allows us to really do a better job, I think, for our site and provide those primitives and allow people to build some higher level abstractions to innovate in that area where they kind of interact more closely with the clients, with people who use the library, right?
Digging into that a little more, like what is it like? How do you think about API design for like library authors with more low level primitives versus like API design for more of an end user? Like what kind of differences are we talking about? Like how do you think about API design differently depending on who you're building it for?
Yeah, when it comes to native primitives, I think like you essentially want every single thing that is possible in native, you want that to be exposed in React Native, and doesn't necessarily means that the higher level abstraction need to also allow for this. So the idea was that you could have very good abstraction for doing most of the job, and it's very nice and easy to work with and intuitive. But then when you want to use some very rare option on a screen, you could still kind of do that because you can just go a level deeper and use that lower level abstraction. So I feel like when doing this type of work, it's important to be as verbose as possible, to not to limit yourself to hey, this option doesn't work, it doesn't exist on Android. I mean, most of the things that we have in screens, they are like very platform specific things that you can customize on iOS, they don't exist on Android, and vice versa.
Yeah. So you're trying to like literally cover the entire surface area of what the native APIs provide that the device is capable of doing. But like most end users, that just becomes noise, and it becomes very hard to like parse out what they actually are trying to do. And so that's where the higher level APIs come from.
Yeah. The role for high level abstraction is to give you a better way of using that, but also to generalize, to give you a ways of building the same thing for iOS and Android without thinking that those things are named differently. They may have different defaults on those operating systems, stuff like that. Right.
It sort of like condenses everything into like one function call, but it's really doing like 6 steps behind the scenes for accounting for platform difference and everything. But like the user only has to call one thing. That makes a lot of sense. Could you theoretically use React Native screens by itself if you really wanted to? Like, does it have to have like a React navigation or something like on top of it?
Oh yeah, it's just not super convenient because what React navigation gives you is it maintains the state, for example. So screens on its own, we don't keep like a state of your navigation. So like whatever components you render on stack, those are the components that are on stack, and that's all. Like if you want to implement like a simple navigator, like simple stack navigation, you could do that, and it doesn't like take a lot of effort. It's I don't know, like 20-line component, maybe, or 30-line, and we have examples and test cases in our repo, and that just do this, and specifically for testing purposes, for isolating issues. And this is very convenient. And yeah, there are many code examples. We have, I think, like 400 different test cases in the repo that just do stuff directly with Screens API, or sometimes the issues can be really spotted when you use navigation or when you use router.
Yeah, like React Navigation is giving you the sort of nice to have things like managing your screen options and your themes and your like tab names and like all this extra stuff. Whereas like screens is like, here's the actual handle into the native, like the native primitives to let you like mechanically do the things that you need to do.
And the whole routing, of course. So screens don't know the names of the screens, whereas in React Navigation, you name your screens. You can reference them by those names. You can push them by their names, and you can also assign
it's
URLs.
very human,
yeah,
rather than machine.
Kind of want to bring in, we're talking about API design and developer experience here. How is it from your perspective when you're building a package like screens for an ecosystem that has more than one platform? I mean, so screens will not work on web, for example, right? It's iOS, Android only. Did you have any special considerations you had to do to kind of consolidate your API? Or is it just, platform specific? You just have to know if you're building your own navigation library on top, you have to know, hey, if I want to navigate to said screen, I need to call this on iOS and call that on Android.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when you just talk about web, it's the answer is going to be different than if you consider other kind of mobile platforms or TV platforms. And specifically, if there wasn't like a native, if there wasn't like a native navigation paradigm, the screens wouldn't be really needed. You don't actually have this problem on web, so we wouldn't have created screens if there was no the paradigm of navigation. It's like fundamentally different. It doesn't really make sense on web because on web, what happens when you are navigating between different, say you can call it screens as well. You navigate between different pages really. It just like the URL bar changes and you basically just go to another page and the whole previous page that was loaded, it's completely gone. So it can be really wiped. So there's some other kind of SPA type of apps and stuff like that. But I'm more referring to like how it worked back in the days where you didn't have, those type of SPA applications. And so you don't have that problem I was describing earlier where you have elements that are just sticking around in memory or somewhere in like a React tree or in the view hierarchy. You don't have those elements because you navigate away, they're just gone, right? You go back, it just loads the previous page. It can be cached, so it loads faster, and it remembers, where you scrolled, to which point you scroll on a page. So it kind of can get you to the right state. But you don't have this kind of mechanism of the navigation stack remembering everything that just happened below when you navigate in. And so that's what's like that. That's the biggest fundamental difference between the navigation web and native, and only kind of makes screens and those type of navigation paradigms to be applicable on mobile, where you have kind of this concept there.
I think as for me specifically, in my day to day, I'm a app developer rather than a library maintainer. With the transition to the current architecture that we're on, with Fabric and all that, and being that screens is such a fundamental piece of all this, how was that transition to the new architecture? Because I believe you all were the first package out there that made the transition 100%, if I'm not mistaken.
That's how I remember it as well. So, I mean, the migration was very painful, and I think mainly because we were the first. So we have this blog post from, I don't remember, like 3 years ago, or like 4 years ago, where we published the first version that was compatible with the new architecture. At that point, the new architecture like evolved a lot since then. So a lot of moving pieces that we had to kind of keep up with. So that made the whole process painful because we're kind of covering those two architectures at every moment. Kind of we're like a test rabbit or a test rat for things that are changing in the way.
Well, you had to do that for a long time.
Oh yes.
Yeah. I imagine you were working pretty close with the Meta, like the core team.
Yeah, from some point when there was like a big shift towards open source at Meta, we started collaborating more closely. So for the past like 2 years, I can't really complain. But before that, there was like a lot of things like moving pieces, and new architecture wasn't really considered stable. But we're kind of knew at that point that this is like the direction for React Native to go to, and we kind of wanted to set an example as a library where you can already kind of use it on the new architecture and kind of serve as an example for other applications to also port to the new architecture. So that was the goal of that migration, to set a precedent that, hey, we are migrating, and like 3 years after that, we are at the point where the new architecture is considered stable. But along the way, there were like, of course, every single release, and those releases, like React Native releases, were happening more frequently and more frequently. Now they're like every 2 months. So every single release would bring new breaking changes in the new architecture API, the way the code generation works, and screens in particular is a library that doesn't just ship like a native module, but it also ships native views, which is like kind of like another layer of integration. So it's a little bit more complicated than if you just had like, I don't know, like a file storage or SQLite type of library where you have method. So this kind of gives you like a cleaner interface and doesn't need to interact with like native views, shadow views, stuff like this. And screens we're using all of that. So we had like custom shadow nodes and all of that stuff. So that make it particularly painful to maintain across all those updates that were happening. But thanks to screens, we also kind of helped shape the way those interfaces were designed, and I hope for the better of everyone else integrating later on. So
I'm sure they probably didn't have too many like folks adopting at that deep of a level in those early days, and I imagined like the feedback and like bug reports and questions and stuff that you guys were having was probably pretty instrumental in shaping how it went. How did you manage just like the bridging like the old and the new for so long? Did you have like a team, like people dedicated specifically to the like keeping up with the old architecture, and then a team dedicated to the new, or was it just like chaos? Like how did you sort of manage that for so long?
So the screens team has never been like a ton of people. So we currently have 3 people who are actively working on screens right now, but historically we have fewer. So the migration was actually mostly handled by Kuba, who is actually now at Expo, and he works on Expo Router. So that's another fun fact about the screens. But it was a while ago, so he left and moved to Finland for a while, and now he's at Expo. And yeah, so the goal was for us to be able to, I mean, we basically wanted to share the code as much as possible, code between those two architecture. Mm-hmm. And from one point of view, it was good because we kind of maintained this in parallel. So we could, by fixing things in one architecture, we also were fixing in another. But also it kind of make the whole code base a little bit more complicated, which is something that kind of make it a little bit more harder to keep up with all the updates over the years, and just complicated the overall architecture of the library. So we're actually now in the process of rewriting the whole stack. So there is like a new version of screens, a version 5 that is going to be coming out in, I'd say, around a month. So perhaps around a month after this is published. Where we're actually completely rewriting screens to only work with new architecture, because this allows us to clean up all that stuff that was the layer where we were kind of interacting with those two different architectures. And in case of screens, it was particularly tricky because we also have those all those all the things that you have in the integration layer. We have them in screen. So we have custom shadow nodes, we have custom properties for the views, and all those things.
Yeah, so you all are following React Native releases very tightly, because React Native version 82 basically marked the end of the legacy architecture.
I think they took it out completely. Yeah, they're like, if you're still on it, you can't upgrade to 82.
Yeah, like 82 is there's only one architecture in 82, and it's the current one. V1 Hermes is around the corner. You all are evolving, and even just kind of looking at your changelog, we're currently on version 4.19, I believe, right now, and you're
20.
all 4.20. There you go. Well, my notes had 4.19. You would know better than me. So even at 4.20, you all are adding new stuff like work on the bottom tabs, form sheet, synchronous updates that are happening and also evolving to rewrite it again in V5. So there's a lot that's happening. Why this constant? What's driving these constant, new features and these new updates, all the time? Because you're doing essentially two new rewrites, quote unquote, at the same time. Version, right around 4.16, you added more features. While I assume V5 started, prior to that too.
Yeah, the main driving force behind us, bumping up the number of people who are involved in the project was the iOS 26 kind of adoption.
Yeah.
Because we integrate with native navigation primitives, and those were like completely revamped in 26. Of course, a lot of issues like for early adopters of 26. You might have remembered that. So that was like a really painful also process about just getting things to work properly on the new release. But they're this is kind of like a main driving force behind us, being our commitment to evolving screens. Like those are the things we integrate with are one of the most frequently changed things across like Android or iOS versions. So there are updates every year happening on navigation stacks and how they look like, some new visual additions or some behavioral changes, gesture changes, stuff like that. So all of that we need to adapt to those things, and this is why we kind of need to follow those updates. And from React Native perspective, though, as I mentioned earlier, the architecture where we were supporting two like old and the architecture, or the legacy and the architecture.
Legacy and the architecture.
Yeah, it was nice in terms of we could share a lot of code, but then it was kind of limiting in the sense that we couldn't use things that are available in new architecture to the full extent, and a number of issues that we've encountered over the years can really be addressed and fixed if we just focus on the architecture. So now we can have things like synchronous events, synchronous layouting. So this is something that is really important in screens, because when you integrate with native primitives, you actually need to override the way it is laid out. So when you have a stack, it can no longer be laid out by Yoga on its own, because the dimension of the screen that you have left after the header is rendered, or if you have a model, so this is dictated by the native layer. So you kind of need to integrate with the layouting in this way, and so handling this in all in asynchronous way is like one of the reasons we cannot have like nice lists in React Native. So in screens, this is pretty similar issue there as in lists, but it's a little bit simpler because you don't scroll through thousands of screens in 5 seconds, right? So it's mostly you just have one screen that shows up, and then another one, and then you maybe go back a few steps. So now we're kind of like in the cleanup phase where we want to clean a lot of clean the code base from that old kind of approach where we supported both architectures, while also adapting things that we can use from the new architecture that would allow us to address some of the longest standing issues in screens.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it really feels like screens doesn't sort of have a feature development cycle of its own particularly. It's all like, are there new native primitives? Are there things changing in iOS and Android that we need to keep up with? You're not really innovating in your own right, because the reason for its existence is to expose like everything that the native.
Yeah, I mean we're also expanding in that front. So like the very first version of screens, it was basically like a screen container and a screen. You didn't have a stack. So stack was like the first addition in terms of new functionality. Last year we added the bottom tabs component, like native bottom tabs to screens, and end of last year we also shipped the first version that included the split view. And the split view is actually the first component that we've written in this new architecture, like for screens new architecture, the one that will be in V5. So this is already compatible with the new design. So split view is like a new architecture only, and kind of follows these patterns and our kind of learnings from building other bits of the screens library.
Well, I'm really excited to install V5 and see what you've all been working on.
Yeah. And split view sounds like a cool concept that hopefully we'll get to integrate it within React Native soon. All right. Well, Krzysztof, I really want to thank you for coming on to the episode and kind of sharing your knowledge about screens and, giving us all this insight within it.
Hopefully our audience learned something they didn't know about a library that they probably have installed in their app.
Not probably. I'd like to say most likely.
Every app I've ever started has React Native screens in it, so I'm glad to know a little more about it.
Awesome. Well, before we sign off, Robin, do you have a mom joke?
I have a good one. This is a variant of one that Gant posted. I'm making it my own a little bit. I just got a new shovel. It's really cool. It's almost groundbreaking.
Awesome. Well, thank you all, and see you all next time.
All right, bye.
As always, thanks to our editor, Todd Worth, our assistant editor, Jed Bartosky, our marketing and episode release coordinator, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Mazen Chami. Our producers and hosts are Jamin Holmgren, Robin Hines, and Mazen Chami. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/radio. A special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe to React Native Radio on all the major podcasting platforms.